The Redwood rest stop, a quiet oasis on a lonely stretch of highway, was about to become the stage for something unexpected. When Jack Thompson, a seasoned Marine veteran, stopped for a cup of coffee, he had no idea that he was about to face an entirely different kind of battle. As he observed a young black girl and an older white man sitting together, Jack's finely tuned instincts immediately signaled that something was terribly wrong. But in a world where appearances can be deceiving, how could Jack be sure? And what hidden danger might be lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary scene? Let's dive into this story. Before we begin, don't forget to comment where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this thrilling tale, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future stories. Jack Thompson, a former Marine, had spent much of his life facing high-stress situations where every decision had to be based on survival instincts. But today, he was simply a tired driver on a long trip, looking for a place to rest and recharge. The Redwood Highway stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun, and Jack decided to pull over at a quiet roadside rest stop. It was a small, remote area with a few scattered cars parked in the lot. Nothing remarkable, just another pit stop like hundreds he had passed before. As Jack stepped out of his car, he took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air of the late afternoon. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, casting orange and red streaks across the sky. This peace contrasted sharply with Jack's memories of his days in the military, when he constantly faced tense and dangerous situations. But today, everything felt calm and serene. He walked into the small diner, where the warm and pleasant atmosphere immediately enveloped him. The room was small and simple, with a few tables, plastic chairs, and old landscape paintings hanging on the walls. Soft music played from an old radio on the counter, blending with the clinking of cups and utensils from the scattered customers. An elderly couple sat in the corner, chatting quietly. A few truck drivers were drinking coffee and talking to each other. Everything seemed perfectly normal and peaceful, an ordinary moment of daily life. Jack only intended to stop quickly, have a cup of coffee, and continue driving. But as he approached the counter, a scene in the corner of the diner made him pause. There, near the window, was a middle-aged white man, likely in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. He sat calmly, holding a newspaper that he didn't seem to be reading. Across from him sat a young black girl, around 8 years old, wearing a light blue dress. The dress stood out in the otherwise muted setting of the diner. She sat quietly, her large eyes filled with worry, while her small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress, as if trying to comfort herself. The strange contrast between the two immediately made Jack uncomfortable. The man looked neat and sophisticated, with a confident and composed demeanor, but the way his eyes glanced over the girl, even briefly, carried a subtle but unsettling control, as if he was deliberately keeping her in sight without making it obvious. The girl, on the other hand, sat there silently and nervously. Her eyes darted around the room, never resting on any point for too long. Her face showed traces of anxiety, and sometimes her small hands trembled involuntarily. This made Jack pay closer attention. Jack wondered what's wrong here? The age difference, the racial difference, and the tense atmosphere between the two set off alarms in his mind. The man could be the girl's adoptive father or relative, but there could also be something darker going on that only Jack could sense. As a former Marine, honed through years of service, Jack's instincts wouldn't allow him to ignore unusual details like this. He stepped toward the counter and ordered a hot black coffee, but he couldn't take his eyes off the scene in the corner. The girl sat there, her small hands still twisting together, her large eyes now filled with a vague fear that Jack couldn't shake off. Questions started forming in his mind. Is the girl okay? Who is the man? Why does she look so anxious? Receiving his coffee from the server, Jack stood near the counter, sipping slowly but keeping a safe distance to observe without drawing attention. The uneasy feeling inside him grew as he continued to watch the girl and the man across from her. Was this just a normal situation for a family on a road trip, or was something more serious happening beneath the surface? In Jack's mind, various possibilities started swirling, but his well-trained instincts warned him to be cautious. The silence and tension surrounding the girl made it impossible for Jack to ignore. He knew that sometimes seemingly ordinary situations could hide dangerous threats. And right now, all of Jack's senses were focused on observing every tiny detail, trying to decide what his next move should be. Jack continued sipping his hot coffee, but his attention never left the man and the girl. He stood near the vending machines, a strategic spot where he could watch without being too obvious. From this angle, Jack had a clearer view of what was happening. The girl seemed increasingly restless. Her small legs swung beneath the table, not quite reaching the floor, while her hands continued fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Every time the man glanced in her direction, she immediately looked down, avoiding his gaze as if afraid to meet his eyes. What caught Jack's attention even more was the overly controlled demeanor the man seemed to be hiding. Although he projected a relaxed appearance, simply reading the paper and occasionally sipping his coffee, Jack couldn't help but notice how the man's eyes would sneak glances at the girl. Every time she made even the smallest movement, like stretching or adjusting her posture, he would flip a page in the newspaper, but never fail to shoot her a watchful glance. The growing sense of unease gnawed at Jack. By now, it wasn't just a vague feeling anymore. Something was definitely wrong. The differences in age and race between the two could have reasonable explanations, but the girl's clear fear and the man's tightly controlled oversight of her movements only deepened Jack's suspicions. His mind raced with questions. Is this man really her father, or is he someone with much darker intentions? Memories from Jack's combat days flooded back. On the battlefield, he had learned to pick up on the slightest signs of hidden danger. His instincts had never failed him, and today, those same instincts were warning him that something was wrong. Jack knew that sometimes you couldn't rely solely on what you saw. The vague sense of fear and helplessness in the girl's eyes made it impossible for Jack to walk away. At this point, Jack began to focus more intently on the small details of the situation. Every move the girl made was filled with tension. Her eyes never stopped scanning the room, as if she were waiting for some kind of rescue or a sign of safety. Every time her eyes briefly met Jack's, she quickly looked away, but in those fleeting moments, Jack could see the deep fear hidden in her dark eyes. Jack realized that he couldn't stand by any longer. Something inside him, sharpened by years of combat, urged him to act. But was he just misreading the situation? He had encountered many scenarios where initial worries turned out to be nothing more than circumstances. Perhaps this was just a family on a long trip, and the girl was simply tired. The man could be a concerned relative. However, the more Jack watched, the more he realized it couldn't be that simple. From the girl's behavior, the stiffness in the man's posture, and the fear in her eyes, everything pointed to something being seriously wrong. This wasn't just the shyness of a tired child on the road. This was deep, profound fear, as if the girl were trapped in a situation from which she couldn't escape. Jack continued standing there, trying to remain calm as his mind processed the possible scenarios. Every part of him wanted to confront the man immediately, but he knew he had to be careful. If he was wrong, if this was all just a misunderstanding, acting too quickly could cause unnecessary trouble. But if he was right, and this man was hiding something dangerous, the girl could be in real danger right now. Jack clutched his coffee cup, but the warmth from the cup couldn't ease the tension building inside him. He decided to observe a little longer. If the girl made any unusual movements, or if his instincts kept screaming at him, he wouldn't hesitate to act. Moments passed in silence, but for Jack each second only increased the pressure. The girl sat there, her small hands trembling slightly, and her eyes avoided making contact with anyone. A chill swept over Jack as he wondered if the girl was silently calling for help, without being able to speak. His instincts began to speak louder. Something's wrong. I need to do something, Jack thought, preparing himself for something bigger that was coming. Jack continued to observe from his hidden spot near the vending machine, each passing moment only heightening his concern. The girl remained quiet in her seat by the window, but her subtle movements seemed to be sending a message that Jack couldn't ignore. Her eyes still darted around the room, and her small hands began making strange gestures, as if she were trying to communicate silently. Suddenly, Jack noticed the girl raise her hand. At first, it was just an unconscious motion. She brought her hand close to her face, but then she turned her palm outward, fingers spread wide. The movement was too subtle for anyone else to notice, but for Jack it immediately brought back memories from his military days. This wasn't a random gesture. From a child, it looked like a distress signal, a gesture he had seen used in dangerous situations when speaking was too risky. Jack's heart raced and his breath quickened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It could just be a normal gesture from a child, but the terrified look in the girl's eyes made it impossible for Jack to ignore. She didn't dare speak, but that small signal, fleeting as it was enough to light a fire of urgency in Jack's mind. A small sign, but it could be a signal for life or death. Jack tried to make direct eye contact with the girl without being too obvious, and in that moment when their eyes met, he recognized what he had been suspecting all along. The girl's eyes were filled with desperation, as if she were begging for help without being able to say the words. She couldn't scream or directly call for help, but in that brief glance Jack could feel her fear and helplessness. No ordinary child would have that kind of look. Her eyes were those of someone trapped, unable to escape. Jack's instincts kicked into overdrive. Every skill he had learned in the military, every time he had trusted his gut on the battlefield, all of it surged back. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. This was no longer a baseless suspicion, this was a silent cry for help. And the girl was trying to tell him that she needed saving. Jack quickly calculated his next move. He needed to act carefully. If he confronted the man directly without a plan, things could become dangerous for the girl, and the situation could quickly spiral out of control. But he also couldn't just walk away as if nothing was happening. Time was running out, and Jack knew that if he didn't act, the girl could be in real danger. Glancing around the diner, Jack saw a few other people eating, but no one seemed to notice the situation at the table by the window. The calm of the late afternoon remained undisturbed, except for the tension Jack could feel bubbling beneath the surface. Where were the police? He silently wished he had already called them, but it wasn't too late. At that moment the girl raised her hand again. Her gaze met Jack's once more, and this time he was sure. It was a signal for help. Her hand trembled slightly, her palm open with her fingers spread wide. An all-too-familiar gesture for Jack, someone who had witnessed countless emergencies in his lifetime. There was no time for hesitation. Jack knew what he had to do. He couldn't risk the girl's life. Quietly, he pulled his phone from his pocket and walked toward the door, keeping his eyes on the girl and the man. His fingers quickly dialed 911. When the operator answered, Jack spoke in a low, urgent voice, trying not to draw attention. "Hello, I need to report an emergency," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I'm at a rest stop on the Redwood Highway in a diner. I think I'm witnessing a kidnapping. There's a black girl about 8 years old in a light blue dress, sitting with a middle-aged white man. She's signaling for help." Jack gave the operator all the necessary details, emphasizing the girl's distress signals and the man's tense demeanor. "I'm a former Marine," Jack added, hoping this would lend credibility to his report. "I believe the girl is in danger and I can't wait any longer." The operator reassured Jack that the police were being dispatched immediately. "Stay calm and don't take any rash actions," they said. "The police will be there in a few minutes." Jack felt some of the tension in his chest ease, as he knew help was on the way. But he also understood that a few minutes could feel like a lifetime for the girl, and he needed to stay calm and hold his ground. He turned back toward the inside of the diner, his eyes still locked on the girl and the man. Jack knew he had set in motion a chain of events that couldn't be undone, and now he had to be ready for whatever might happen next. Jack lowered his phone after the call ended, but his emotions were still in turmoil. He knew the police would arrive soon, but every passing second heightened his sense of unease. He returned to the diner, maintaining a reasonable distance while trying not to draw attention, but his eyes never left the girl and the man. As Jack re-entered the diner, the girl's behavior only confirmed his suspicions. She no longer glanced around as much as before, but her small body looked even more rigid and tense. Her hands remained twisted together on the table, but her eyes no longer met Jack's. Instead, she stared blankly ahead, as if trying to avoid any attention from the man across from her. The man, on the other hand, remained calm. He turned the pages of his newspaper slowly, but Jack noticed that every few seconds the man would glance over at the girl with a controlling, cold gaze. This only made Jack more worried. This wasn't how a father or guardian would look at a child they cared for. That gaze was something else, a kind of control Jack had seen before, but not in normal situations. It was the way someone might look at a hostage, not someone they were supposed to protect. Jack knew he couldn't wait much longer for the police. In just the past few minutes, all his senses had sharpened, like he was back on the battlefield. He needed to make a decision. Should he wait for the police, or should he intervene right now? But if he confronted the man directly, could that escalate the situation? If the man was dangerous, would he panic and do something rash to the girl? But every time Jack looked into the girl's desperate eyes, he couldn't just stand by any longer. Even knowing the risks, Jack decided to act. He took a deep breath, set his coffee down on the table, and slowly walked toward the table where the man and the girl sat, trying to keep a calm expression. Every movement was calculated, slow enough not to raise suspicion, but deliberate enough to remain alert. As Jack neared the table, the man looked up at him. His expression shifted from indifference to curiosity, with a hint of wariness showing on his face. Jack forced a slight smile, but inside he was preparing himself for anything that might happen. "Good evening," Jack said, his voice steady but not overly friendly. "Everything all right here?" The man raised an eyebrow, seeming surprised by Jack's question. He nodded, a forced smile appearing on his face. "Yes, everything is just fine. We're just resting after a long trip," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of tension in his words. Jack didn't reply immediately. Instead, he paused for a moment, looking directly into the girl's eyes, hoping to see some kind of sign. She remained still, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, and her eyes flicked quickly toward the man before returning to the empty space in front of her. From a distance, she seemed to be trying not to do anything that would attract the man's attention. "Is she all right?" Jack asked, his tone softer, directed at the girl. At this point, Jack's caution became even more pronounced. Every word he spoke was carefully chosen, like a way to test both their reactions. The man chuckled lightly, a cold smile playing on his lips but still maintaining a polite demeanor. "Yes, she's just tired. You know how kids are. She's my niece." Jack looked at the man but didn't respond. Instead, he crouched slightly to get on the girl's eye level, hoping to make her feel safer. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. The girl didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted toward the man again before quickly looking back at Jack, and in that brief moment, Jack saw the fear clearly reflected in her gaze. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She just gave a small, stiff nod as if she were being forced. Jack's heart tightened. Everything he had observed, the tension in the girl's posture, the coldness in the man's expression, and that unnatural nod, confirmed that something was seriously wrong. But Jack knew that if he pushed too hard, the man might become more defensive, and that could put the girl in danger. He decided not to press further, and instead stood up, moving back toward the counter, as if he were simply checking in. As Jack turned to walk away, the man called after him, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "Thanks for checking in. Have a good evening." Jack gave a slight nod but didn't turn around. He knew now wasn't the time to respond to the man's fake politeness. The police would be there soon, and Jack wouldn't take his eyes off that table until the girl was safe. But inside, Jack was ready for anything. If the man made any sudden moves, Jack wouldn't hesitate. In this situation, the girl's safety was his top priority. As Jack moved back toward the counter, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The conversation he had just had with the man hadn't eased any of his suspicions. If anything, it had made things even clearer. The man's cold, controlled demeanor, the girl's silent fear, and the stiff interactions between them all pointed to the fact that this wasn't a normal situation. But what worried Jack the most was the girl's behavior. She was completely restrained, unable to express herself freely, and the quick glance she had given the man before nodding only made Jack more certain. Standing near the counter, Jack looked outside, scanning the area around the diner. The parking lot was still mostly empty, with only a few large trucks and personal vehicles scattered about. The evening light had faded, giving way to a dim twilight, but that did nothing to calm the tension bubbling inside him. The police had been called, and he knew. They were on their way. But each minute dragged on like an hour, and Jack felt like he couldn't just stand there waiting. Jack quickly ran through possible scenarios in his mind. He couldn't do anything too risky before the police arrived, because any sudden action might provoke the man into reacting negatively, especially if the girl could get hurt. However, if the man realized he was being watched or suspected, he might try to leave immediately, and that could be the most dangerous moment. Jack understood that he needed to stop the man from leaving if there were any signs that he was about to make a move. While these thoughts spun through his head, Jack noticed the girl making another small gesture. This time, she raised her hand to brush her hair. But Jack saw that this wasn't just a casual gesture. Her palm was still open, her fingers spread in a specific way, as if she were repeating the distress signal she had used earlier. This couldn't be a coincidence. Jack immediately reached for his phone inside his jacket pocket, glancing around to ensure no one was paying attention. He called 911 again, his voice more urgent this time, filled with determination. "Hello. I'm the person who called earlier about a suspicious situation at the Redwood Highway rest stop," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady but firm. "I'm still here, and I'm sure the girl is signaling for help. I need police to arrive as soon as possible. This man could be dangerous." The dispatcher responded professionally, reassuring Jack that officers were on their way and would arrive within minutes. "Please remain calm and observe the situation. Do not confront the man unless necessary," the dispatcher instructed. "We've contacted the nearest patrol unit. They should be there in about 5 minutes." Jack knew those 5 minutes would feel like an eternity, but knowing the police were on their way brought him some relief. The most important thing now was to avoid tipping off the man that he was under close watch. Jack glanced back toward the table where the girl and the man were sitting. The man still appeared calm, seemingly unaware that he was being monitored. But Jack knew that any sudden movement could change the situation dramatically. He decided to maintain a safe distance, returning to the vending machines to give the impression that he was just another customer, not someone watching an unfolding emergency. But his eyes never left the table, and he kept observing every movement of the girl and the man. The tension inside Jack didn't let up. If the man realized the police were on their way, or sensed that Jack was onto him, he could do something drastic. Jack was mentally prepared to intervene if the situation took a dangerous turn. He couldn't let this man leave the diner with the girl, not without the police getting involved. Time seemed to drag on, but finally, Jack heard the distant sound of police sirens. The sirens grew louder as the police approached, and Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. The patrol unit had arrived, and this would end soon. Jack glanced out the window, seeing the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the diner's windows, signaling that help had arrived. He turned back to the table where the man and the girl sat. The man began to look nervous, his eyes darting quickly toward the window, where he could see the flashing police lights. The girl remained silent, but Jack could see her hands clenched tightly together under the table, as if she were bracing herself for what was about to happen. Just then, the man stood up suddenly, grabbing his jacket, and in an instant, Jack knew he was planning to leave. Jack's heart raced as he immediately stood up, his eyes following the man's every move. "Don't go anywhere," Jack told himself. He knew that as soon as the police entered, everything would be under control, but if the man tried to leave now, the situation could become extremely dangerous. Within seconds, the diner door swung open and 2 police officers entered. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but also prepared himself for whatever might happen next. As the 2 officers entered the diner, the atmosphere changed instantly. All eyes turned toward them, But only Jack understood the full significance of their arrival. Jack kept his distance from the man and the girl, not wanting to do anything that would escalate the situation. However, his eyes never left the two central figures. The man, noticing the presence of the police, showed a brief change in expression. His face tensed, and his eyes darted quickly toward the door, clearly assessing the situation. He awkwardly stood up, grabbed his coat, and seemed to be preparing to leave. A wave of anxiety surged in Jack's chest. He's going to try to run, Jack thought. Everything was coming to a head. As soon as the man stepped out of his chair, Jack could feel the tension. The man gently tugged the girl's hand, as if preparing to drag her out of the diner before the police could react. The girl lowered her head, and Jack could see her eyes filled with fear, her small hands trembling as the man gripped her tightly. Unable to stand by any longer, Jack decided to act. Before the man could reach the door, Jack quickly stepped toward him, making it look like a casual encounter. "Are you leaving so soon?" Jack asked, keeping his voice calm but not hiding his seriousness. His gaze shifted between the man and the girl. The man flinched, stopping for a second, then forced a smile, though tension flickered in his eyes. "Oh, we were just getting ready to hit the road," he replied, his voice sounding normal but with a hint of unease. He glanced toward the door and then back at Jack, as if weighing his chances of escape. In that moment, Jack realized the man might do something reckless. But before Jack could take any further action, the two police officers approached, one of them speaking loudly. "Excuse me, sir, we have some questions for you." The man froze in place. He turned his head, staring at the officers. While his face didn't change much, Jack could sense the anxiety in his movements. The girl remained silent beside him, her face downcast, but her hands still gripped tightly by the man. One of the officers stepped forward, his sharp eyes fixed on the man. "We've received a report about a suspicious situation involving this girl. We need to confirm your relationship with her." The man, trying to maintain his calm, forced a strained smile and said, "Oh, she's my niece, we're just traveling together." But Jack knew the answer wasn't convincing, and it was clear the police felt the same. One of the officers moved closer, looking down at the girl. His voice was gentle but professional. "Your niece, young lady, can you tell me who this man is?" The girl didn't answer immediately. She trembled, and her eyes quickly flicked toward the man, as if afraid to tell the truth. Jack saw that fear and felt his heart tighten. But then, the girl seemed to gather all her courage, and her lips quivered. I need help," she whispered, her voice so quiet that if no one was paying attention, they might not have heard. But for Jack and the two officers, it was enough to take action. The man's expression changed abruptly. Panic and tension flashed across his face. He tightened his grip on the girl's hand, as if ready to drag her away. But before he could do anything, one of the officers stepped forward and firmly said, "Sir, let go of the girl and step back." "She's my niece, you don't understand," the man protested, his voice tense and frantic. "Let go of the girl now," the officer repeated, his voice harder and more authoritative. The man hesitated for a moment, but he eventually complied. He released the girl's hand, though he stepped back with clear unease. The police immediately moved in, with one officer placing a hand on the girl's shoulder, gently but firmly reassuring her that she was safe. The girl was shaking, but this time, when she looked up at the police officer, her eyes no longer held that absolute fear. Instead, there was relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment for far too long. Jack stepped back, watching the scene unfold. A wave of emotion swept over him, knowing that he had been right to trust his instincts. The man began to argue, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding, that the girl was his niece. But his protests no longer mattered, not after the girl had spoken up. The officers gave him no further chances. One of them quickly moved in, handcuffing the man, while the other continued to check on the girl. The man was led out of the diner in handcuffs, still shouting that it was all a mistake, but his words fell on deaf ears. The truth was clear now. He had no right to the girl. Jack watched as the police escorted the man out the door, then turned his gaze back to the girl. She was still trembling, but now safe under the protection of the officers. Jack felt a huge sense of relief wash over him. His suspicions had been confirmed, and he had done the right thing by trusting his instincts. One of the officers approached Jack, thanking him for reporting the situation. "You did the right thing by trusting your gut," the officer said. "If you hadn't intervened, we don't know what could have happened to her." Jack nodded, feeling that any words he might say would be unnecessary. He hadn't acted for praise, he acted because he knew a life was in danger. And in the end, the girl had been saved. The girl looked at Jack, her eyes full of gratitude. Though she didn't say anything, her expression spoke volumes. Jack gave her a slight nod, a quiet farewell, before quietly stepping out of the diner, leaving the police and officers to handle the rest. As the man was handcuffed and escorted out of the diner, the girl was still shaking, but there was now a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The police began gathering details, trying to piece together the full story. A female officer gently led the girl away from the noisy diner and sat with her, while another checked the arrested man's documents. Everything felt like a surreal dream for the girl, but at least now she wasn't alone. Jack stood nearby, watching everything, trying to take it all in. He still felt somewhat shaken, though everything was becoming clearer. One of the officers approached Jack, asking him to recount the events, from the moment he entered the diner to when the girl signaled for help. Jack recounted everything briefly but thoroughly, including his gut feeling about the unnatural tension between the man and the girl. As Jack spoke with the police, the girl began opening up to the female officer. She explained in a soft, trembling voice that the man wasn't her father or relative. He had kidnapped her from her school a short time before. Her mother, whom she had been estranged from after the courts granted custody to her biological father, had planned the kidnapping with the man. The girl's story immediately shifted the officers' focus. Upon a quick check, they discovered that the man had no legal claim over the girl and no custody rights. The police began questioning him, slowly uncovering the truth that this was, indeed, a well-organized kidnapping. While the girl was comforted and taken care of, the officers delved deeper into the investigation. They learned that the girl's mother had lost custody after a lengthy court battle with her biological father. Her father had been granted full custody, and the man who was arrested was her mother's new partner, a man with a criminal record. Together, they had planned to abduct the girl from her school, aiming to take her out of the state or even the country. Jack listened to this information with a heavy heart. He realized the situation was far worse than he initially thought. Without his intervention, the girl might have been taken away without anyone noticing, and she might never have seen her father again. The cold, calculated nature of the plan made Jack feel angry, but at the same time, he felt relieved that he had trusted his instincts. A little later, another police car arrived, and from it stepped a middle-aged man with a face full of anxiety and tension. This was the girl's biological father. He had been notified by the police and had driven over immediately upon hearing the news that his daughter had been abducted, but was now safe. His face showed a mixture of fear and hope, and his eyes frantically searched the crowd for his daughter. When he saw the girl sitting with the female officer, tears welled up in his eyes. "Emma," he called out, his voice breaking with both worry and relief. The girl turned her head, and in that moment all her fear melted away when she saw her father. She jumped out of her seat and ran into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Daddy," Emma cried, her voice filled with both the remnants of fear and the comfort of knowing that everything was finally over. Her father knelt down, holding her tightly in his arms, crying with her, his hands shaking with emotion. They held each other, no words needed, as their reunion said it all. Jack stood back, watching this scene unfold, feeling a deep sense of peace. He didn't need to participate in this emotional moment, but he knew that. He had played a part in bringing the girl back to her family. Everything had fallen into place. One of the police officers approached Jack after the emotional reunion had settled down. "We can't thank you enough, Mr. Thompson," the officer said. "If you hadn't reported this, we don't know what could have happened. You saved a life today." Jack nodded humbly, not needing to say much. He hadn't done it for praise. He had acted because he couldn't ignore the signs of a child in danger. In the military, he had learned that courage isn't always about doing something heroic. It's about acting when needed, even when the situation is unclear. Emma's father, after holding his daughter for a while, came over to Jack. His face was still streaked with tears, but his eyes shone with deep gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my daughter. Without you—" Jack gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," Jack said, his voice warm and steady. "Anyone would have done the same." But the father wouldn't let it go. "Not everyone would do what you did. You took action when others might have looked away. I owe you my life." Jack just smiled. He knew he had done the right thing. And in that moment, seeing Emma safe in her father's arms, Jack knew that everything had ended well. The truth had come to light, and the family had been reunited. After the emotional reunion between Emma and her father, things gradually calmed down. The police began wrapping up the necessary procedures while Jack kept his distance, allowing the family some space. He watched from afar, feeling a sense of relief as he saw the girl safe in her father's arms, but his thoughts still lingered on the events that had just unfolded. What the girl and her father had gone through wasn't something easy, and Jack understood that their road ahead would be tough. Emma's father, after speaking with the police and comforting his daughter, returned to Jack's side. His eyes were filled with gratitude. He approached Jack, shaking his hand firmly, as if this was the only way he could truly express his thanks. "Mr. Thompson, I know I've said this before, but I need to thank you once more," he said, his voice calmer now after the emotional hours he had just endured. "You saved my daughter, and I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Jack simply shook his head, gently refusing the praise. "You don't need to repay me," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I just did what I thought I had to do. Anyone would have done the same if they saw something wrong." Emma's father smiled, but there was a resolute look in his eyes. "Not everyone would have done that, Jack," he said, his voice firm. "You chose to intervene while many others might have walked away. You trusted your gut, and that saved my daughter." Jack felt a bit awkward at the compliment, but before he could respond, Emma's father continued. "I want to invite you to our house this weekend. We're having a small gathering, and I would love for you to come. After what you've done, you're part of our family." Jack was a bit taken aback by the invitation, but the man's sincerity left him with no reason to decline. "All right, if it means that much to you and your family, I'll be there," Jack replied, smiling softly. Emma's father's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. I look forward to seeing you again in a much happier setting." Jack nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing he had helped bring safety and peace to this family. The two men shook hands once more before Emma's father returned to his daughter. Jack stood back, watching Emma hold tightly to her father, looking happier by the moment. While Jack knew that Emma still had a long road of healing ahead of her, at least she was safe now, and that was all that mattered. As Jack prepared to leave the scene, a female police officer approached him, asking if he could come down to the station to give an official statement. Jack understood that this was necessary and was ready to do everything he could to ensure the kidnapper was properly prosecuted. After finishing the remaining procedures, Jack drove home, though his mind still lingered on the image of Emma and her father. The events of the day reminded him of his responsibility, not just as a former soldier, but as a person willing to act when needed. A few days later, as promised, Jack went to Emma's family's house for the gathering. When he stepped into the backyard where the party was taking place, he was greeted by Emma's father's smile and a warm, welcoming atmosphere filled with family love. The setting was entirely different from the tense moments at the highway rest stop just days before. Laughter and cheerful conversations blended with the smell of the barbecue, creating a relaxing mood. Emma's father came over to greet Jack, his smile wide. "You made it. It's so great to have you here. Come join us." Jack smiled, shaking the man's hand. "Thank you for inviting me." Not long after, Emma appeared holding a small ball. When she saw Jack, her face lit up. "Uncle Jack." Emma ran toward him with a bright smile. It warmed Jack's heart to see her so happy. She had overcome her fear and was slowly returning to the joyful child she was meant to be. "Hello, Emma." Jack crouched down, smiling at her. "You seem a lot happier now, don't you?" Emma nodded, her eyes sparkling with joy. "I'm so happy, thank you." Seeing the dramatic change in the girl, Jack felt his heart swell with happiness. He knew Emma still had a long journey ahead to heal from her trauma, but at least, surrounded by her father's love and support, she would be okay. The party continued in a friendly and joyful atmosphere. Jack gradually felt less like an outsider and more like part of the family. The laughter, the warmth of family bonds, and the relief of knowing everything had ended well created a feeling that Jack wouldn't forget. Toward the end of the party, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Emma's father approached Jack with a drink in his hand. "You know, Jack, that day at the rest stop you didn't just save my daughter, you changed our lives. Emma and I will be forever grateful to you." Jack simply smiled, taking a sip from his drink and glancing at Emma, who was happily playing with the other children. "I didn't do it for gratitude. I just did what I thought was right." Emma's father nodded, his eyes shining with joy and gratitude. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, and not everyone has the courage to do it. Jack didn't say anything else, simply watching the children play. He understood that there are moments in life that don't require a lot of explanation or praise. What matters most is the action, and sometimes the smallest actions can change someone's life. The party ended as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, and Jack prepared to leave. He waved goodbye to Emma and her father, knowing he had forged a deeper connection than just saving a life. That trip hadn't been just about saving a child, it was about creating a bond between strangers, thanks to courage and trust in what was right. As he drove home, Jack felt a lightness in his heart and a sense of peace. One small action, one right decision, had made a huge difference in a family's life. And in moments like that, Jack knew that sometimes courage isn't about a battlefield, it's simply choosing to act when it's needed most. When Jack left Emma's house and drove home, the streetlights began to flicker on along the empty road. In his mind, the memories of recent events remained vivid. Even as a former Marine who had faced countless intense situations, Emma's story gave Jack a completely new perspective on courage. Sometimes the battles don't happen far away. They happen at home, where small actions can make a big difference in someone's life. Jack reflected on the journey from the moment he walked into the diner at the rest stop to the time the police rescued Emma. Everything had happened quickly, and his instincts were the only thing he could trust. His decision to intervene wasn't because he thought of himself as a hero, but simply because he felt it was the right thing to do. If he hadn't had the courage to act, things might have turned out very differently. As his car moved down the empty road, Jack couldn't help but think about the other lives that might be impacted by seemingly small decisions people make every day. He realized that life often hinges on those brief moments when we must make choices that can change everything. His action at the diner had saved a girl from danger, but more importantly, it had reunited Emma with her loving father. As Jack drove home, he felt a deep sense of relief. All the worries and tensions had melted away. Emma was safe, and Jack knew that she would now have a peaceful life in the arms of her loving father. Jack also knew that Emma's father would do everything possible to protect his daughter in the future. Returning home, Jack parked his car in front of his small house. Stepping out of the car, he looked up at the night sky, where millions of stars twinkled. A sense of peace washed over him, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. In this moment, Jack knew that he had done the right thing, not only for Emma but for himself as well. He had chosen to act rather than look away, to be brave rather than fearful, and in the end, it had all been worth it. Jack stepped into his home, sat down in his armchair and felt his heart finally at ease. He understood that sometimes great things don't come from heroic acts on the battlefield. They come from the small, meaningful decisions we make in everyday life. That night, Jack slept soundly and peacefully. He knew that what he had done would leave a lasting mark on Emma's life and her family, And more importantly, he had found meaning in taking action, even in the seemingly smallest and most ordinary moments. In the weeks that followed, Jack resumed his quiet life, though he continued to receive calls and messages from Emma's father. They had become friends, and more than that, Jack realized that Emma's family had become part of his life. There were get-togethers, shared meals, and conversations that strengthened the bond Jack hadn't expected. Every time Jack saw Emma, he noticed how she gradually returned to being the cheerful, innocent child she had been before the kidnapping. She would always run up to greet him whenever he visited, and for Jack, seeing her smile was the most wonderful thing he could hope for. It was a symbol of hope, protection, and courage. Jack's life had changed since that day at the rest stop, but it was a positive change. He had learned that sometimes just one person willing to act could change someone else's life. And more importantly, he had learned that courage isn't just about facing fear. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the situation. Emma's story would always be part of Jack's memory, but the important thing was that from that day forward, he had found faith in the power of action, compassion, and the ability to change someone else's life. And to Jack, that was all that mattered. Thank you all for taking the time to follow this meaningful story. If you found this story inspiring and want to see more content like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss out on future videos. Let's continue spreading positive values and the power of kindness to everyone. Thank you for your support, and see you in the next videos.